Library. I'm Peter Ratcliffe, one of the two co-founders and directors. Beth Cleary in the white over here is the other co-founder and director. There is cookies and hot tea, and there are restrooms downstairs. How many of you are here for the first time? Wow, right, so great. So we have to get somebody from the other hemisphere to come in to get people. It's good, it's good. So I will just take a minute to explain that this is, hi Michelle, this is a historic Carnegie Library. Andrew Carnegie became the richest man in America by exploiting immigrants who worked in coal mines and iron mines and steel mills. So they're the ones that we have to thank for this space. And we are in a neighborhood that, of course, like all of St. Paul, was originally native land, Dakota land. And when Dakota people were driven out in the early 19th century, immigrants from Northern and Western Europe began to move in. Over a period of almost a century, they built institutions, organizations, families, strong lives for themselves. And then in the late 20th century, neoliberal globalization pulled the rug out from under them. And 15,000 unionized blue-collar jobs left this neighborhood, and a lot of European descended people moved away. At the same time that neoliberal globalization was pulling the rug out from under people in Central America, Southeast Asia, and East Africa. And some of them responded to the changes in their lives by immigrating to the United States and coming and living in this neighborhood in St. Paul. And Beth and I have lived in the neighborhood for about 20 years, and we wanted to do something to bring people together, to share their stories with each other, in the hopes that the descendants of earlier immigrants, hi Marisha, the descendants of earlier immigrants would see similarities in their experiences with those of newcomers, and conversely, the newcomers would learn from the descendants of earlier immigrants. So that's what the Eastside Freedom Library is about. And so we've collected about 20,000 books, all of them donated, often by retiring activists and academics, or the descendants of passed on activists and academics. I hope that if you have time tonight, you'll poke around and look at some of what's on the shelves. And we do a lot of programming. So somebody should have harassed you when you came in to sign the guest book or sign the clipboard, so that we can stay in touch with you and let you know about what else is happening here. Just one thing that immediately comes to mind, we will have a similar event, sort of similar, on the 24th of October. David Muir will be reading from his new book in conversation with Ed Buckley and Shannon Gibney. So get that on your calendars, October 24th. So this is a really great treat to have this wonderful group of people here and to have you all here. So I'm going to turn things over to Sophia Kim, who is our moderator for this evening. Oh.
Welcome and thank you for joining us tonight. I'm Sophia Kim, and I'll be your moderator. We are so excited to have Sisonke Msimang with us to discuss and read from her memoir, Always Another Country. I think it speaks volumes about Peter and Beth that so many people, so many of their former students return to read and to share their artwork. And just a little plug, there's this humble little box up there for donations, so please be generous to me. Okay, so in conversation with Sisonke, we're honored to have Kao Kalia Yang and Lina Jamoul. The way is I'll I'll introduce the presenters. Then Sisonke's very good friend from college, Sha Cage, will introduce Sisonke. And then Sisonke will read for a little under 10 minutes. The presenters will offer comments, and then I will join them in conversation for 20-25 minutes. We will then have 20 to 25 minutes for questions and comments from the audience. So let me introduce our presenters. Kao Kalia Yang is a Hmong American writer. She is the author of The Late Homecomer, a Hmong family memoir by Coffee House Press in 2008, winner of the 2009 Minnesota Book Awards in Creative Nonfiction Memoir and Reader's Choice, and a finalist for the PEN USA Award in Creative Nonfiction and the Asian Literary Award in Nonfiction. Her second book, The Song Poet, by Metropolitan Books in 2016, won the 2016 Minnesota Book Award in Creative Nonfiction Memoir. It was a finalist for the National Book Critics Circle Award, the Chautauqua Prize, a PEN USA Award in Nonfiction, and the Dayton's Literary Peace Prize. In the fall of 2019, Yang will debut her first children's book, A Map into the World, by Carol Rhoda Books. Also a book about refugees in America titled Somewhere in the Unknown World by Metropolitan Books, and a co-edited anthology, What God is Honored Here, an anthology on miscarriage and infant loss by and for Indigenous women and women of color, to be published by the University of Minnesota Press. Lina Jamoul was born in Syria and grew up in Cyprus and London. Her parents tried to organize for justice and democracy in the late 1970s in Syria and eventually had to leave the country because of their political work. The value of bringing people together to have a collective democratic voice and keep those in power accountable is deep-rooted in her family history. Lina holds a Ph.D. in human geography from University of London. She is a union and community organizer and currently the Executive Director of the Minnesota Association of Professional Employees, a labor union that represents state workers. Lina is also a theater artist and has performed in various productions throughout the Twin Cities and Chicago with Pangea, Lakeshore Players, Minnesota Fringe, Prop Theater, and Halcyon Theater. Sisonke Msimang is a South African writer who focuses on race, gender, and democracy. Now I will turn it over to Shay to introduce Sisonke.
So there's a tradition in the community here, particularly when we have incredibly strong artists that have a history with Minnesota, Minneapolis, St. Paul, and they've gone and come back. And it's just called making noise. And if any of you guys have heard of call and response, you know what that means, yeah? So make some noise and make them feel like we want to be here, we want to hear what they have to say. So lift your voices, put your hands together, and make some noise. From South Africa, so I'm going to ask you to do better. You know, it's right. Some know Sisonke as an essayist for the Wall Street Journal, New York Times, The Guardian, and more. Some as an author, some as someone that's worked at the UN in the past. Someone who has mentored and worked with several sectors of the HIV community in Africa and Minnesota. Some know her from her videos online where she's telling stories or speaking on her own history as related to gender, as related to politics, as related to growing up in exile. But I know her as someone who has always been a fighter, a brilliant researcher, a student, a nurturer, an activist. I know her as someone who has inspired so many of us because her and her genius as a writer that I don't think she remembers when she left Minnesota over 20 years ago. She is responsible for at least, I would speak for myself, at least 5 of us who found our own artistic voice through her. And I remember reading one of her first poems, and it just blew me away. I was a teenager, and I grew up in the South, and I always thought that mentors were people who were older than you. But Sisonke taught me that that's not true. And so it's such an honor to have her back. And I am she just gave me a title today because I elected myself as the head of her fan club. CEO. So I am the proud CEO of Sisonke Msimang fan club. Jokingly, but also seriously, I really am starting a fan club because there's so many people that couldn't be here today, particularly Black and brown people that want to be connected to your work. And so for my birthday in November, we're going to have a community-wide reading of her book. So everybody is invited. So there will be information we'll share with Peter and Beth. So we'll read the book and we'll come together as a community and discuss the book, and we'll share the results of the songs. Ashe.
Wow.
So now I have tears in my eyes. Thank you so much. This feels. Hi everyone. Hi. So thank you so much. This feels very nostalgic, and I'm serious. I do have tears in my eyes because it's been a long time since I've been here, and those words were incredible, and I feel like I'm sitting with a group of women who are more than peers, more than, yeah, thank you. I appreciate this very much. And thank you to Peter. This space is incredible. So I wrote this book, which is called Always Another Country, which is a memoir, because I'm getting, very old, long in the years. And really it's a story about a family, which is the only way that I think many African women could consider writing about themselves, is to really amplify and spotlight others. So it's a portrait of a family, my family, which grew up, and I grew up in exile, which meant living in many different countries. And amongst the places we passed through, for me, was Minnesota. And the Twin Cities was home for 4.5 years in college. And I made the most incredible friends here, including Sha Cage, who stepped on the stage. And there were 5 of us in a poetry troupe, and only one of us had real talent. But we tried, and then the minute that Shay stepped on stage, it was very clear that there was going to be a spotlight on one person. So I'm going to read a passage called Freedom from the book, and it talks about some of my time here in the Twin Cities. I was in exile as a young person who was a South African. So Freedom is about Nelson Mandela's the vote for freedom. Suddenly, freedom is no longer coming. It has arrived. The date is the 27th of April. The year is 1994. On this day, Black South Africans gain full citizenship rights, and white South Africans begin to put the stain of racist shame behind them. The occasion is momentous. In countless acts across the country, as the day unfolds, white and Black South Africans move towards one another like newlyweds about to take a vow. Until this point, whites have collectively been skittish about the impending day. They are afraid of how their lives will change. For so long, they have understood the world in terms that are either black or white. Oversimplification has been a key ingredient in apartheid's success. Now they are thrust into a world of gray, of doubt and anxiety and exhilaration. Despite their full participation in the steps that have led them here, many white people remain fearful of what this new era might bring. On this bright autumn day, they let go. The letting go has been months in the making. Jingles have played on the radio and television every day, imploring us all to respect one another, to give peace a chance. Brenda Fassi's Black president has been on heavy rotation in shebins and nightclubs across the country, getting us ready for Nelson Mandela's confirmation as President of the Republic of South Africa. posters in the green, black, and gold of the ANC and the orange, blue, and white of the National Party adorn streets in every city. Political rallies fill stadia, crowds roar their jubilation, singing, "Viva the ANC, viva! Long live the spirit of the UDF, long live!" We race toward our destiny. When the day finally comes, it is both climactic and oddly overwhelming. On one hand, there is joy and noise and celebration. On the other is a barely audible sound. It is apartheid's long, slow hiss into obsolescence. Quite suddenly, apartheid has lost its spectral force. It is a demon defeated, no longer a Klansman on a horse, inspiring fear in the hearts of black people. The night rider who terrorized us for so long is revealed for what he is, a little boy in a billowing sheet with cutout eyes. Sitting perfectly still underneath the uplifted sheet, he is peculiar and sad. He looks like he is trying to disappear. This revelation of this unveiling is greeted by a surprise moment of silence, but it is only a short pause. Within seconds, South Africa is hurtling towards democracy. In the streets and across great swathes of rural country, the euphoric young rub shoulders with those who are simply grateful that they have lived to see this day. Old women achingly bend and tremblingly mark, they silently cross and they dutifully fold. Even before papers are counted, victory is assured. The authority of those who have for so long been the wretched of this land is unmistakable. Ululation fills town halls and ripples through trees and across valleys, lifting in the wind. Hands wave, bedecked in white gloves. We are Iskatamia and Maskandi music. We are Hugh Masekela's husky voice. We are the breath in his trumpet, the long purple note of freedom. On this day, even the weather complies with our wishes. There are no rains, only blue skies and stillness in the reeds. God has decreed that today, nature will not interfere with the triumph of humanity. And so, with our landscape serving as a steady backdrop, we move and we groove, we sway and we sashay, starting in the Ferris Cape and ascending north toward the mighty Limpopo. Watch. See how we shimmer and how we weave our bodies in a timeless domba. We are the sacred Venda python, sloughing off our old skins as we enter history's gates. We are majestic, glistening into the future. We wind and we wend and we dance ourselves to exhaustion. As the moon rises, we know that soon, when the votes are counted and the results are announced, we will finally be free. As South Africans rise to begin their day, to cast their ballots, I'm in Minnesota, driving towards Chicago in a rented minivan. In the car with me are two mandlas, a Khomutso, a Lunga, a Spusiso, and a Rojin, all of us students at various universities in the Midwestern state of Minnesota. We are on our way to the South African consulate, determined not to miss out on history. We arrive at the consulate and we are ushered into a small waiting room and then into the area where we will vote. We left very early in the morning. I stand in the sterile booth under dead fluorescent light. Until now, I would have had no cause to be in this building. The consul would have turned me away. But in one fell swoop, this has changed. The irony of this hits me hard as I look at my identity document. I am 20 years old, about the same age that my father was all those years ago when he left South Africa. I mark my ballot with a vote for Nelson Mandela and the African National Congress. Afterwards, I look for a phone. I have topped up my AT&T calling card. Remember those? We are old. In anticipation of the lengthy call, the phone rings across the world in Durban, thousands of kilometers away, and Zhang, my youngest sister, picks up. I ask excitedly, how was it? At 15, she's too young to vote, but she has no trouble answering my question. Amazing, Sisonke. I wish you were here. She's in high spirits, and her voice has the quality of bubblegum. It carries across the static in the line like pink and blue glitter thrown into a breeze. She describes everything, the exuberance of the crowds, The fear that it might all go wrong, the hilarity of two old white women insisting on jumping the queue, even as democratic elections were taking place that sought to put an end to that sort of behavior. She laughs, and with her special brand of social commentary, she does a faux newsreader's voice, saying, "Here, reporting live from the front lines, we have Mrs. Smith. So, Mrs. Smith, you want to skip the line because you're white? What are you voting for then, Granny?" I think, yes, Mrs. Smith, I can confirm that you get to stand at the back of the queue like everybody else. The old days are officially over. We laugh uproariously, grinning at what a long road it will be for some white folk. Our missing each other is tangible through our laughter. The phone is passed around. I speak to everyone, cousins and aunties and uncles. The house is full of relatives and friends who have come to share the day with us. Ours is the home where everyone has begun to congregate in the year since the family returned to Durban. Finally, Baba, my father, is on the line. I clutch the telephone receiver as though by force of will it might transport me to Durban. "So, you're in Chicago," he says. "Yes, Baba," I respond, trying to pretend that I'm not overwhelmed by the sound of his distant voice. "Well, that's good," he says. "I'm glad you made it." We are quiet for a while, suddenly unsure of what to say. Then he says what I have been waiting for him to say. "Here we are, Sisonke girls." He uses his affectionate name for me. He laughs, and then awkwardly, almost in a whisper, as though he can't quite believe it himself, "We did it. We are free." That X marked in a voting booth in Chicago marks my spot in history. It marks my place in a new nation at the start of a new era.
Hi, can you all hear me? I so enjoyed your book. Thank you for your work. As a stateless child and so many ways a new American, an American that is still always coming home. When people say, "Oh, you're an American too," that I really felt very closely to your statelessness. But going through the book, every step of the way, I knew that South Africa would be free. I knew that you would one day belong somewhere. Unlike me and so many other Hmong refugees, there is no Hmong land waiting. And I'm curious, how, you read a beautiful excerpt, and so how has it changed who you are to know that there's a place in the world that is yours?
So thank you. That's a very powerfully phrased question. The people have often described, Salman Rushdie describes exile as a ball hurled high. This idea that you're in a suspended motion, that you're both coming up but also waiting to come down. Yeah, that sort of both things are happening at once. And so, for us growing up, for a lot of the time we didn't know that we would be free. So we lived thinking that, hoping that we would be free. And my parents always assumed that South Africa would be free. But to be honest, by the time we were in our teens, my sisters and I were a bit skeptical about the whole enterprise, whether that guy on Robben Island would indeed be free. But once we came home, we still didn't quite belong, because once you've lost what you've lost, you can't get it back. So you have to think about home in a different way. And so I think part of the kind of journey of my life and the journey of the last 25 years of a free South Africa, of being able to live at home and in the place that I had always believed that I belonged, that was home. In my mind it was home. We were told it was home. We never allowed the places we were living to be home because we were going home. So it was home. It is home. But it didn't feel familiar. And so the last 25 years of making South Africa home has made me understand how much home was love. It was the relationships between my sisters and my parents that my mother worked very hard to foster. And that the one thing that she knew that the rest of us didn't know was that we already had home, which was each other. So, yeah.
Thank you. wouldn't be me if I didn't go here, but I want to say, I want to put out a trigger warning. You know, in light of what's going on in America right now, Dr. Ford and everything that's going on with Judge Kavanaugh.
Yeah.
In the book, you write hauntingly, beautifully about that violence that happens. In your case, you were just a young girl, and he was a much older man. He came from a different class, and so in some ways, socially, he could never touch you in theory, right?
Yeah.
But this thing happened anyway. And I, as I was reading, I thought about my own daughter, and I thought about my own mother, as a memoirist as well. I'm wondering if your parents have read the book, and if you have had that conversation.
Yes.
And I want to thank you for your courage.
Thank you. It's interesting when you use the word courage, because it doesn't feel like it describes me, and yet often, you know, when we tell personal stories, people say, "Oh my goodness, you know, you're so courageous, or you're so brave," and to be honest, because I didn't put anything into the book that I hadn't already really worked through, and that I didn't. So there's a lot that's not in the book, and that's mine, that's private. And then what I put in the book is okay for people to know, because I think there's a value to them knowing. And if I hadn't dealt with my sexual assault for many years at a deeply personal level, I wouldn't be able to put it into the public domain. And so watching Dr. Ford, who didn't want to be in the public domain, feels very challenging, it feels very confronting. It's been a very emotional week, I think, for many women, not just in America, but I think around the world, because it's not just about the violence that's enacted on your body, it's also about the choices we make about when to speak and when not to speak. And that should always be a choice that is up to a woman to make, right? We decide when we're going to share our stories and how much of our stories. And just as much as being public about our stories is important, being private about what we want, not because it's a secret or because we're ashamed, but because it's ours. And so I've been struck by that this week. In terms of my parents, my mom had already passed away by the time the book came out, and she knew. And my father didn't know, and the old people in my life, who I write about a lot in the book, didn't know, and so we had to talk about it before the book came out, because I didn't want them to, you know. And of course, it's always easier to tell strangers about things than it is the people who are closest to you. So those were very emotional and beautiful conversations. The book's been out in South Africa for more than a year. And in some ways, they responded exactly as I had hoped they would, which was with love and grace and deep regret that that I felt that I couldn't tell them. So, yeah.
Thank you.
So my experience of the book, I was at a talk once, and the person talking said, a really good talk is when you feel someone's talking to you personally and directly. And I really felt like you wrote this book for me. So I just felt so deeply moved reading this book. A lot of tears, and somehow felt seen by someone whose experiences are completely different to mine, and yet there's something in here, there's something about exile and belonging and home for those of us who are kind of like the Salman Rushdie, the ball, that experience can be quite isolating. And so to be, for that experience to be seen and reflected is just incredibly powerful. So thank you for that. So I wanna ask you a question about power. And you got here in page 333 in this version.
There's so many versions.
So you talk about the ways that power intersects and operates So power intersects and operates in ways that can simultaneously advantage and disadvantage all of us. Can you say a little bit more about that?
Sure, I don't remember which part of the book it is, but I know what I generally mean by that. So when I was writing the book, part of what I wanted to reflect on, and this idea of belonging, is both about geography and a sense of home, but it's also about the ways in which we belong to groups. So of course, for the experience of Black South Africans is that we have a connection based on race, which is a connection based on the idea of race, which is a connection based on what has been done to us. Yeah. So there's a real connection there, and South Africa continues to be a remarkably racist place, and I guess it's no surprise. And so we talk about race a lot, but what we talk about less is class. And as a person who really believes, I think probably still idealistically, given what's happening in the world, in this notion of citizenship, that when you are a citizen of a place, everyone has a right to belong somewhere. Everyone has a right to be a citizen of a place. If it is not the place that you were born or want to live in, somewhere else will give you citizenship. And that idea is in crisis at the moment, as we all know. And ought not to be in crisis, but it is. And so I still believe in citizenship. And as a South African citizen, it is incredibly important to me that I have some skin in the game. And that means acknowledging my own power as a middle-class woman. So if I expect to hold white South Africans accountable for the ways in which they often continue to be complicit in racist structures and institutions, for ways in which they withdrew from the process of reconciliation or pretended to be involved in it but were only superficially so, then I need to also hold myself accountable for the ways in which my class privilege operates, for ways in which I, the daily decisions and ways in which I may live my life widen the gap between those who do have and those who do not. And so power intersects with privilege in many, many ways. And there are people who have very little power, and I am not one of those people. I am a person with middle-class privilege who comes from a society in which the education that exile afforded me means now that I can live in South Africa in ways that are really comfortable if I wanted to, and that's confronting and important to be honest about. And then the honesty is for a purpose, which is to deal with that, to get rid of that inequality. So that's what I mean by that. Yeah.
Earlier you mentioned, I'm not sure what the exact sentence was, but when to speak and when not to speak. And I'm curious, where did you have to get, what point did you have to reach in your life before you could write this memoir?
My mom had to pass away. So I don't think that I fully understood where I belonged until I didn't have my mother. Because she made place for us, so without seeming to try, without really looking like she was doing it. And so when she was gone, and suddenly there was like these spaces that needed to be filled socially, these bridges that needed to be these gaps that needed to be bridged, that you hadn't known were there, but for her not being there. And then you realize, oh, okay, what she was doing was so much more than what we could see, which is why we loved her so much. We just didn't know why we loved her so much, right? So I think I couldn't have written this memoir. So I wrote this memoir in the year after my mother died, having moved to Australia, and I wrote it, I was able to write it, one, because she was no longer there, and I was thinking about her all the time. And so she defined my notion of how I always belonged in every society we lived. My mom set up a routine, a framework, and she just had a way of being comfortable with herself and also with the people around her. Soft-spoken, hardworking immigrant, mother, but always we had friends quickly. She made friends. She endeared herself to people. So because she was gone, and because I was living in a place where I didn't have social connections, had the time and the space and the mental, freedom to really think about belonging as more than geography, and it was her. So yeah.
I'm also, every border that you cross, there's something that happens that says so much about that place. So when you first go to Canada, there was a line, nobody was all that interested in us. And you talk about peacocks versus being a turtle. And then you have your first racist moment with a boy. And I was struck by the coherence of that particular story. And actually the coherence of many of these encounters, even though they are kind of absurd. And I wondered, did you have to craft it in that way, or how do you allow for incoherence, even though you have to find some coherence as a writer?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it was top of mind in terms of craft as I wrote the book, and it's probably something how that you can reflect on as well. So for me, there are some stories that in the moment that it is happening, you're like, this is going to be a good story. And then they become family stories. So there were some of those that were just obvious, right? Canada being one of, the school teacher, the school one being one of those just iconic moments. And then there are others which present themselves as incoherent, and my first day in Minnesota was one of those, like just complete madness happening all around me. And so I had to impose coherence on it. And you impose coherence on it afterwards, not in the weeks that followed the event, but in this case, really in the years that followed. Because the thing about getting old is you do become more wise. Like, it's great to get older because puzzles fit together, and things that happen much later, the analysis that you frame because you become more clear in your feminism, or you get more intellectual tools, and so you're like, that's what that means, right? You put it in perspective. So time and I think wisdom give you more perspective. So some of them were literally incoherent, felt incoherent as they were happening, but became coherent as I wrote the book, or much later in life, they became coherent. Yeah. But I'm curious about whether you agree with that.
Oh, definitely. My grandma, she liked to say, my grandma liked to say that surrounded by wisdom, without the experience to back it up, you don't know how to use it. So it's very much exactly what you said. But for me, writing is a process of reckoning on the page. I'm not looking for the perfect answers. There are no perfect answers to real life, people. There's no reason why my fourth youngest uncle died last month. When his older brothers they had prepared all of us for their deaths, but he died, Or one of the great trees in the forest of your youth falls down, and there's that empty space. When you grow up poor in terms of class, I grew up very poor in America. My mom and dad worked really hard. They were never able to make friends with the other people at the factories because people weren't interested in making friends with them. People wanted their labor. They weren't paid to come in and meet the quotas. They weren't paid, they said, to talk. And so I had a very different experience right here, 3-4 blocks away from here, actually. This is the library of my youth, people. So it's always like coming home, So for me, writing is very much not about making sense of what doesn't make sense. It's about meeting it on the page. Growing up, I used to start all these stories and I could never find an ending. And so then I just stopped, or I kill myself, and then that was solved. That when the leading character goes down, story's over, right? But at some point I realized, particularly as I was finishing my first book, I can't make sense of some of the grave injustices, some of those painful moments. And so sometimes it's very much about bringing my readers into that moment with me, encountering the source of the crime. You meet it with me, and we make of it what we will, understanding that my readers that they too are human, and that they know that feeling of helplessness, the feeling that the whole world is falling down. My father used to say, when the sky you live under falls on you, when the ground that you walk on throws you off, anything is possible. And so for me, it's never about coherence. I want to meet the impossible. What happens when the sky is shaking, the earth is rocking you off? It's that moment that I live and I think and I imagine in. Because in my fantasies, we can always find an umbrella that is strong enough to catch some current of humanity that is blowing through. And so I never try to make sense of the impossible in that way. And I think I can live and do that despite everything because I grew up tremendously well loved. When there are a lot of people who love you, you don't have to struggle so hard to make sense of the seemingly impossible. So I'm comfortable with that gray area, and I think readers of my work know that that's where we are. We live in a world where we cannot control all forces. We never can. The things that we can control are and this is where we, I think, end in the same place. Love. How we love, who we love, how widely we love, how deeply.
So that actually, that brings up so many questions for me. One is, for all of you, you have, I think the thing that you share in common is that you are in solidarity with those who are vulnerable and who are in struggle. And Sisonke, in your book, when you were at McAllister, you were drawn to African American students. And I thought that was so interesting. You talk about the difference between the African students and the African American students, and how the African students were sort of judgmental of the African American students, almost seeing them as damaged. And so when you talk about, and you write, if I may, there's this way that you write about it, that I feel like even most Americans cannot capture this. In America, I learned quickly that to be Black is to be both unknown and unknowable. As an outsider, I see almost immediately that this society deliberately misrecognizes Black people, and the effect of this is to diminish them individually and as a group. Can you all talk about why you are in solidarity with those who are vulnerable and those who are in struggle?
Like, why do you breathe? I don't know, it just happens. I think it's a way of belonging, and it's a way of love. There's the quote, and I'm not remembering exactly right now who said it, but something like, justice is love in public. So, for me, in the organizing work that I do, and in feeling a sense of solidarity, it's a way of belonging.
I think one reason is white supremacy is so strong. Minnesota doesn't measure high on racial equity measures. We're like second worst in the nation. Unemployment rate, home ownership rate, the disproportionate people in our prisons. I grew up on the east side of St. Paul in the falling down houses here. Grew up in a house that would eventually be demolished, My parents bought it for $36,500, and I thought, wow, Laura Ingalls Wilder could live here. I grew up, I belong to one of the most linguistically isolated groups in America. We are one of the poorest groups in America. I come at it from a very personal place. My grandma knew 2 English words, right? Low and no. When she picks up the phone, low, no. The first white people to come to our houses were social service people, and then they were the Mormons and the Christians trying to convert us. Because I am also, a Hmong, we believe in shamans and animism. And so when you were already in such a tight, close space. You know, here on the east side of St. Paul, by the time I was growing up, my neighbors were black kids and Mexican kids and Hmong kids, you know? They were my first friends in the world, and I saw how all of us were getting treated every step of the way. I grew up as a selective mute. I never talked, you know? And so the ways in which I built solidarity then were, you know, if I had a pencil and they needed one, I'd break mine in half. Or if you have a stick of gum, you share it, you know, things like that. But that extends into who I've become. You know, when I tell my stories, refugees from all over the world, they say, that's my story too. And it is important for me as a human being, you know, because I have to live in the words of my father, right? That his daughter, that her work will go beyond her gender, and will go beyond her people, that it is for a greater humanity. I have to believe that the pulse of humanity is the same across the vast terrain of this earth. I know what it is like to want. I know what it is like to go to a school like Carleton, to hold a hole in your jacket for a whole trimester because you're afraid other people will see. And then you realize that people with money never see. And that's the problem. Yeah, people with power never have to reckon, you know? And so that's why I buzz, that's why I speak. It's never that I have all these great ideas or big long words or things, but my heart hurts people. I think that's why I do it. My heart hurts when I see people suffering. My heart hurts when I see people want and despair. When I know that the world could be better than it is. You know? And that first line where I stand is among a lot of women of color who feel the same way I do from where they're positioned. That individually we can change the course of destiny, the course of history. And so you stand where you're welcome and you fight as hard as you can for the world that you believe in. And a lifetime isn't a long time, 60, 70 years of the you know, maybe 80. and you know, you have to lay down your mantle, you know? And so for me, that includes a lot of teaching. And when I teach at places, certain places, there's a lot of rich kids I'm teaching. So I'm teaching them from a very different perspective, drawing away to things that they've never seen, never cared to look at. And that's a different kind of service. Then when I'm teaching the community colleges, it's a whole bunch of immigrants and new refugees, you know? And so it's an important part of my work, and it's an important part of who I am. It's how I center this off-kilter heart that I've been given.
I think for me, South Africa would not be free were it not for the solidarity of the world. So really, we're gifted our freedom by the fact that everybody believed that this abomination could not exist. We could not, in our lifetimes, have a country where white minority rule was just an accepted sort of part of humanity. So I think I have been my life is a product of solidarity, of international solidarity, of people sort of caring very far away about what would happen to us. And I think, you know, seeing the sort of backlash against that historical moment in which there was a global consensus on human rights, that refugees had rights to be resettled, to live, that we all had a right to belong somewhere, that stripping back of that global consensus, watching that happen has been very, I think, very difficult for all of us. And you know, we know all the political reasons why it's happened, but it doesn't make it any less, you know, difficult to watch. I think on the question of, you know, of my kinship with African American people, you know, when I came to America, I had been raised in a political family, and so the politics was given to me. You know, it's part of that. It's like, you know, Marxism. You know, we were communists, so there was no church. There was Marx. You know, South African kids in exile. You know, ANC kids went on camp to Cuba and to the, you know, Black Sea, right? So that was how I grew up. But then coming to university meant that I got to choose my politics for myself. You know, that's what you do when you grow up. When you're a teenager, you know, you become 18 and you say, okay, what's my politics? What do I choose? So I was very critical of my parents, you know, this mushy, non-racial, you know, let's love everybody, you know, white people, black people, green people, let's all be together, you know. I think coming to college was a point for me to say, I want to depart from that. Like, why do we love Nelson Mandela and not Steve Biko? Like, what about this Malcolm X guy? Like, he seems kind of interesting. You know, why only Martin Luther King, right? So I pushed the boundaries and I began to expand my intellect and to think about radicalism. But part of why that was possible for me, why it in fact had to happen for me, was because I encountered racism of the American kind, which is such an interesting brand. What a varietal, right? Woohoo! And you know, when you grow up as a demographic majority, you don't understand what it's like to become anonymous. So I grew up not questioning, black people are intelligent, black people are dumb. Some black people can dance. Oh, most black people can dance. Some cannot. Some black people are fun. You know what I mean? Like, we are the range of humanity. We're everything. It's you know, it's not there. I have to think about that. Some of us are very beautiful. Some people are not. It doesn't. My essence of who I am is not questioned. I grow up, in fact, you know, as part of this post-independence, you know, cohort of young children who were raised in the first generation of post-independence Africa in the 1970s. And so the future is in front of us, and everyone on that continent believed that we were going to shape that continent. Africa was not a basket case when I grew up. There had been no dictators. There was no corruption. We were that first generation of kids in whom all the dreams and aspirations of Africa was poured onto us. So when we went to school, everyone was rooting for us, you know? So I grow up like that, supremely confident. It never occurs to me that I'm not the most special person in the world. It just didn't occur to me. And then, of course, loved, profoundly loved by the entire community of, you know, this very cosmopolitan group of people, you know, who are acting in solidarity. Russian people who have moved to Lusaka to participate in the freedom struggle for Southern Africa, like what? You know, black people who are the first this, first that, you know, first black person ever seen in Sweden. Crazy first. Everyone tooting their own horn. And then I come to America and like people just stand in front of you in a line because they don't see you. Or, you know, your landlord is like, who are you? I'm like, but I pay you rent every month. You know, so you literally blur into like this blob. And so that was very confronting for me, and that really helped me to focus and think about the sharper end of the stick, that we were fighting for a non-racial South Africa, but we had to deal with race consciousness was a way to begin to unpack the sort of structural stuff, all of this stuff. So I come full circle. I've softened with age, but that was a very important phase for me. And so for my connection with African Americans then is one of also being this group of people who are like me in exile, at home, but in exile, you know, not quite American, and yet after indigenous people, the first Americans. And so I really felt that kinship, that real connection with people who were outsiders just like me.
Thank you so much. At this point, I'd like to open it up for questions and comments from the audience. Who will be the first brave one?
Should I just stand up and talk loud?
Well, the folks at home need to be able to hear us,
Okay.
so is that working?
Can you hear?
No.
Yes. Right. Stand up. Can you hear?
Yes.
Yeah.
So I loved your book about how you were honest about things that would seemingly be hard for you to talk about. Like when you had your baby, that first reaction of, you know, you married somebody that you didn't expect to fall in love and marry a white man, and you look at your baby and you're like, so white. You were really honest about a lot of things, and I think that some of the really, to me, the really striking parts were when you decide to leave South Africa, your home where you have come to after graduating from college, and why you and your family choose to leave, and what it was like, what it's been like for you to not be in South Africa, and maybe you're living back there now.
Very heart sore, extremely heart sore to grow up outside South Africa and then marry this Australian who then, you know, has this, I don't want to give too much away from the book, but we are living in Australia for the last 3 years. Although I don't think that I'm fully living in Australia because I've been home 6 times this year, and I was home 8 times last year, and the first year it was 11. So it's getting it's getting less and less every year. But yeah, so it's been very hard. At the same time, I think this understanding that love is belonging has really helped me to not fall apart with not being in South Africa. But I am literally a South Africa addict. Like, South Africa really is, in some ways, my intellectual obsession as well as my heart. And I often say this to South Africans. I'm like, you may have like a street that you grew up on, all these aunties who, knew you from the minute you were born, but I am South African. I am South African because I belong to the country. I am I'm a national entity. I'm not from a region. I don't believe in tribe. I believe in the idea of South Africa. This place that we fought for, this place where, where we can live together in spite of our history. Like, I believe in that idea. So I am home a lot and doing the back and forth and a friend of mine said when I moved to South Africa, she was like, wherever you go, there you are. And in many ways, that's exactly what's happened. Like, I've kind of recreated that sense of community, the storytelling that I do, all the same issues that I have always cared about are the issues that I continue to work on. I just do them in a couple of places now.
Next, anybody? Questions or comments? Well, I don't remember exactly where it was in the book, but there was a moment, I've just got here in my notes, from Malcolm X to Bell Hooks, ? Can you talk about that transition a little?
Sure. So, one of the things that became apparent in our first years of reading, and Shay will remember this, is that we read a lot of black nationalist men because they took up a lot of oxygen, as men tend to do. We've seen this. So they were writing books. They had a lot of things to say. Men. And it occurred to me that part of the way we have conversations, not just about race, but about many things, is framed by a particular masculinist discourse. That there is a way to talk about how we relate to one another that isn't polarizing, and that is filled with love, and that isn't defined by the way men have traditionally talked about it. So I think we fall into a trap of talking about politics and race in deeply confrontational ways, which is not to say that we shouldn't talk about race and politics in deeply confronting ways. But I think to be confronted emotionally, to be confronted intellectually is a different thing from being confrontational. And this is a moment around the world where confrontational politics is so damaging. And the more we do it, the worse that wound gets. I think this last week, being in this country and watching that horror show on television has become more and more clear how much of a zero-sum game politics has become. And it doesn't have to be, and it wasn't always. It really wasn't always a zero-sum game. And part of it, obviously is the social media and the fact that so many of these conversations are happening not like this, in real life, touching each other, seeing each other. When I first started doing my talks around this book, I said to a friend of mine, I hope, I'm really worried that the trolls are going to come. They're going to come because they're terrible online and to say, so I just, you learn to ignore them. But I thought they'd show up. And my friend is like, what are you talking about? The trolls never come up. They never come to events. And it's true. So it doesn't mean that people who come to your events all agree with all you say and whatever, but people who come to your events are not ashamed to talk about their views in public. So I do think there's something to be said for showing up in real life. So, we're not gonna, get rid of social media and whatever, but certainly I think using social media as a tool to organize so that we can meet up is very important, because that's the only way we're going to begin to unblock this polarization. When you look at someone, it's very hard to be incredibly mean and combative. Like, it can happen, but look what happened today. What a wonderful example, right? This young woman said, really? Really, Jeff Flake? Is that how we're going to do this? Right? So I think there's something about being in real life with one another, in communion, I think is really important, even for the toughest conversations.
Hi. I'm curious to know, just feeding off of what you said about confrontational politics, I'm curious to know what your experience has been in South Africa and the way that South Africans relate to other Southern Africans. I'm from Zambia. Bueno. Yeah, so I'm curious to know what you think about that. And then I was very surprised to hear you say what you said about how you viewed Africa in the, like, when you were growing up. It was so different from, like, my experience growing up in Zambia. So it was surprising to me to hear that you perceived Africa in such a, like, positive light, seeing it from the outside. Because growing up in the 90s, like right after colonialism in Southern Africa, was a very difficult place to live. So I just want to hear more about that.
It's amazing how how quickly generational change happens. So the 1970s Lusaka that I grew up in was a hopeful place, and Kenneth Kaunda, in his earliest years, was a man who inspired us all. And obviously that changed, and he stayed too long, and all the problems that we now see. So, you know, when you grow up in the 1990s, it's a different continent, you know, and it's seen differently in the world. Part of the politics that I wanted to convey was that the narrative of Africa should not be fixed. So I think there is a fixed narrative of Africa, and that is fixed in time and around a certain set of events that have been, you know, happened in fairly recent times, and that the Africa that I grew up in was not that, and that the Africa that we want to create will not be that, but that we can't fix the narrative of what our continent, you know, is. So that was part of what I was trying to do. Xenophobia is a really massive problem in South Africa. Part of the story of apartheid was a story that was told to black and white people simultaneously. That's how propaganda works. Everyone gets it sprayed at them. And the propaganda was that South Africa is the last outpost of civilization. It's civilized because white people occupy it and run it. And the black people who live in South Africa, because of their proximity to the white people who are civilizing them, are better than the Africans who live north of the Limpopo River. So that propaganda really worked. And so, you know, when we first came home, people would often say, oh, you were in exile? And they say, yes. And I think they want you to say that you grew up in, like, the UK or something. That's the better exile. And then you would say, they say, where did you grow up? And you say, Zambia. Oh, you grew up in Africa. And I'm like, but where are we? You and me, standing here in South Africa, or in Africa, right? So this notion of Africa being beyond the borders of South Africa is still, to this day, very much ingrained in South Africans. And so the xenophobia that you encounter amongst South Africa it's a function of that politics. It's a historical legacy of apartheid. We are deeply xenophobic as a nation. And so this is part of the stunting of the imagination of what South Africa can be. One of the biggest threats to South Africa is that although we have many refugees and many migrants who make our country so much richer, I mean, we have the worst food in the world. We have boring, terrible food. Were it not for the migrants, I don't know what that situation, I mean, right? You know, I would rather eat Nigerian food any day than South African. Like, our just food is bland. It's terrible. You tell South Africans this, they start getting upset. This is true. So my point being, the notion of what South Africa is would be enriched in the same way that the myth of America is, this migrant place, we know all the problems with it. But in some ways, buying into that idea that you can become South African if you love the idea of South Africa, and we will not let people in. In South Africa, the definition of a South African is someone who withstood and had a relationship with apartheid. What is stunting, unimaginative way of thinking about yourself as a country? But it's part of South African exceptionalism. It's very similar to American exceptionalism in that you guys have had this particular experience where you think America is different from every other place, right? No other country has had settler colonialism. No other place has massacred indigenous people. No other place has migrant, right? No other place wants freedom. Like, this notion of these exceptional countries, right, is very, I think it stunts our idea of how we can be a better place. So yeah, those are my thoughts.
I think you're speaking to something.
I just want to say a little bit of something. I think you're speaking to something really powerful about where the stories are coming from Africa. I'm writing this book right now for Somewhere in the Unknown World, where I'm just interviewing a whole bunch of refugees, and I've learned something about Liberia. I've learned something about Somalia. I've learned a lot of things, and all of these stories are different, and I think it's not really, and this is where I would beg to differ. I don't think it's a generation that you're growing up in. I think it's the class privileges and the people that surround you. So, I think that depending on where you are, your realities are different. Your understanding of Africa is profoundly different. Part of the problem in America, literature, and the world literature that we accept is that we prefer literature from South Africans, we prefer literature from Nigerians, we prefer very select group of writers. And so that all of these other voices we don't hear about, all of these other visions and realities of Africa we don't hear about, these interpretations that are equally valid we don't hear about. So I think you're speaking about something very real, and I think that there is perhaps a bit of a flaw of the genres that we're both working in. When we're writing about making memoirs, you have to keep the scope moving all the time, otherwise you can get trapped. But your reality is really valid, your perspective, and I think perspectives beyond your generation, people who are 60, 70, coming from different parts of Africa, their understanding of Africa. And so I want to thank you for that very brave comment.
It reminds me a little bit of the quote earlier about power advantaging and disadvantaging all of us at the same time. So my aunt, who is from Syria, wanted to marry a Palestinian, and my grandmother would have none. It was like she almost disowned her for another Arab ethnicity that was seen as less than. And then my Palestinian friends growing up had maids who were from the Philippines, and they were less than. It's just like there's this hierarchy, and none of us are immune, and we're caught up in it in different places.
I think we have time for one more question or comment or something.
I just wanted to ask a question about the value of hardship in shaping people.
Well, we become who we are because of the hard things, not the easy things in life. Simple fact. We become who we are because of the hard things. When I think back to my grandmother, when I think to my parents, when I think to myself, you never want to play, Olympics of any kind, but the reality is that we are shaped by the hard things. And so every single life, every given life, I meet so many white Americans who tell me, oh, I don't belong to an incredible story. I have nothing to tell. And I'm always like, really? Because I think it's about taking responsibility for the worlds that we belong to, the lives that we're given, the lives that we yearn not just for ourselves, but for those around us, for those far away from us. Some people have easy lives only because they don't care about the other people suffering in their countries or their neighborhoods. Life is as hard or as easy. because you dare to make it. The world would not be what it is if rich white people hadn't done some incredible things, as well as really poor people whose stories you'll never hear about, you know? And that's part of the work that I do. You know, it's not about the hardness of just being me, you know? Slightly plump, 37-year-old, fully capable of reaching to a certain extent. You know, I mean, my condition, right, people, is not the most fascinating human condition in the world. But there are other conditions out there, conditions that have made me, conditions that make the world that we belong to, that we must take on. Nobody has an easy life. It is about how hard you want to fight for the world that matters.
I appreciate that question, and it reminds me of a comment from my son, my oldest son. He was just born with the gift of empathy. He's got such an incredible heart, and he's also a curious soul. He's also the most sensitive in the family. And it's interesting watching him grow up as a young black boy in times of hardship and in times of, I mean, I grew up in the South, and so there's a philosophy that, just speaking from my own family, that the strongest men were those that were the hardest, the toughest, those that could endure the most, those that have been through the most hardships. And I find myself as a mother and as a cultural worker, community worker, activist, as I get older, pushing back on that a little bit, because I do feel like, we forget that we can experience the world through our own realities and others. You know what I mean? Like when I remember when I learned about Steve Biko. It wasn't because I grew up in a certain place at a certain time, but I understood that story in a way that transformed me and led to a certain activism in me. It ignited something. So I look at this room, right? And I'm also, I'm very optimistic about the future. And I think, what is all of our roles? And what is that role of those that are not in a certain class that I am, to step into the center of the circle? You know what I mean? And so, yeah, I guess I just feel like it's very complex when we talk through how we're shaped and how we grow at different times in our lives. And so I feel more inclined to say yes and.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think this idea of, I think we're living in a time when it is very easy for some people to glamorize hardship and to use that as a way for themselves not to take responsibility. It's sort of linked to what Kao was saying about the notion that if you're white, you're neutral. You don't have a story because you haven't, quote unquote, suffered. White of a particular class, because we know there's lots of white people suffering in very many complex ways in this country and in many others. So to not flatten that category, I think is really important. But to also say that hardship isn't an entry, that to think about hardship, one, in much more broad ways, and then to think about why hardship is the entry point into getting things done. And I don't think that should be the way that we want to get things done. I also think it's dangerous because it leads to a place where people who are black, who are brown, there's a race to the bottom, right? It's the Olympics, that we then can only be authentic, the proper kind, the representative kind of black person, the representative kind of woman, gets their authenticity from trauma. So I think we are trying to work towards a world in which there is less and less trauma, in which there's less and less hardship. And so I think it's always about, what I try to always think about, what I try to write into, in the same way that Kao tries to write into the gray, not solving the problem. I try to write into the gap between the world as it is and the world as it ought to be. That space of constantly holding that this is the world now, and we have to deal with that reality and not be in the fairies, that's not real. And then, where are we going? And do we want a world in which hardship is what defines our humanity? Absolutely not.
I think hardship's just so interesting. There is something of this Olympics hardship thing that's kind of both attractive and not, it's just easy to fall into, but there's a way too that hardship can harden you and isolate you, and so and people have different versions of hardship. So finding connection. My immigration experience, mine and my family's has been particularly difficult for different reasons, and in Cyprus especially. And what's interesting, so I was living in Cyprus. We didn't have our proper documentation, so at any time we could be kicked out. And so I'm 13 years old and I read the autobiography of Malcolm X. And I'm a Syrian kid in Cyprus and find this big connection to the autobiography of Malcolm X. And so it's kind of hardship, but also an inspiration too. And then for many years I fell into this trap of being kind of isolating myself because of the hardship, and for hardship to soften you to others rather than harden you into yourself.
Well, I think it's not necessarily an uplifting way to end, but thank you so much, everyone.
So there are books, there's still cookies, still and books, and some people sign, right? Will sign books. Yeah.